the evening, which, as you all know, is about fake news legislation in Asia. Is it a threat or safeguard to media freedom? And just to quickly introduce our panel, on my far right on the screen over there is Kirsten Han, who's joining us from Singapore. Kirsten has been very vocal and articulate on particularly Singapore's recent passage of draconian legislation, and she is editor of New Narrative, a regional online platform, and we'll talk about that and other issues. Next to her, also on my far right, is Tess Bacala, Executive Director of the Southeast Asian Press Alliance, who's speaking for, the impact on media and how it's reverberating in the regional media. Next to her is Matthew Buga, head of the Asia program for Article 19, which is focusing on free speech and hate speech issues as well as fake news in the region. And finally, last but very not least, is Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch Asia Division. So what I'd like to do is really have a free-flowing discussion and encourage your questions and comments. So there'll be plenty of time for that at the end. But perhaps to kick it all off, we could start and hear from each of the panelists about how critics say that fake news legislation in various countries is aimed at destroying or damaging media freedom. And we've had a big backlash about that, and we've seen a lot of journalists penalised, accused of all kinds of crimes related to fake news. But others claim that it's a necessary move to legislate to curb the destructive impact of fake news. And most people would agree that the fake news phenomenon has indeed been part of the rise of hate speech on the internet, religious and sectarian violence, and the derailing of democratic elections. So I'd like to hear, what is the overall impact of legislation on the media and on broader human rights issues in the region, and how should we deal with the fake news problem in the digital age? And I think we're going to start with you, Tess, and move down the panel line.
Hello.
Yep, that's all right. I think we can hear. Say again.
Just a quick background on the Southeast Asian Press Alliance, for those of you who might not have heard about it. Southeast Asian Press Alliance, or SIPA, is a membership-based organization. We're based here in Bangkok. We were essentially championing press freedom and free expression in the region. One of our core activities is to monitor threats and attacks against journalists across the region, and so we do it on a regular basis, and on the basis of which we have some specific initiatives to combat the rising threats to press freedom. Just a quick thought on fake news as a term. In several discussions, at least within our network that I've participated in, there's usually at some point discussions would turn to whether we should keep using the term fake news. And we say that to use that term necessarily prompts the question of whether it's helping address issues around the threats to press freedom. Essentially, we say, at least in these conferences or fora that we've organized or that we've participated in, using that term, this is a disservice to the work of legitimate media. And it doesn't help raise the level of discourse on what's going on in the region where fake news it's okay.
Sorry, hold on. Is that fixed now? Okay.
Because
Is
when
that
when we discuss issues relating to specific measures,
I think we need to fix this, right? It's what was turned off?
No. Turn this one off and leave this one on. It's done now.
Okay, go.
hello.
No, we're still getting an echo.
We're still getting echo. Okay, carry on.
Hello.
No, we're still getting it.
Hi.
At least we're hearing an echo up here.
You're not echoing.
I'm not talking to a mic. I'm loud anyway.
Oh, do you want to try talking to your mic?
Hello.
It's still echoing. Okay.
Hi.
Okay,
Okay,
that's
I think
better.
that's better.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought I'd just share a quick thought, not just mine, but actually in our circle of media practitioners, journalists in our network and different parts of the region. So discussions would usually be around, among other issues confronting press freedom and free expression in the region, on whether we should keep using that term. I say this because in discussions on issues around press freedom, of course, this would naturally turn to what do we need to be doing. Among others, we need to be promoting media literacy, but that's going ahead of of the main points that I wanted to say, because many people in Southeast Asia don't seem to understand the real work of journalists, and to keep using that term sort of conveys the message that media themselves, at least the legitimate media, could be purveyors of the so-called fake news or disinformation and propaganda. As you might know, there are already the so-called anti-fake news legislation in some countries in the region. The first one to pass such a law was Malaysia, and now Singapore has it already. The Philippines tried, but there was a lot of pushback from journalists, so they didn't push through with it. Although this is not to say that it's not going to be, there's not going to be any attempt to pass such a law. But by and large, the anti-fake news legislation or anti-disinformation laws are one of the visible elements of the information disorder in Southeast Asia. I say one of the visible elements because among others are, we have a raft of repressive laws in the region, and they've been coming one after another in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Indonesia, and even in a country like Timor-Leste, which is the only one called free, or in the World Press Freedom Index. Among all the countries listed there, including the Philippines and Indonesia, of course, Timor-Leste is the only one that's described as free. But there's already an attempt to regulate social media in a country like East Timor, considered the youngest democracy and considered better off in terms of the situation or state acknowledgement of the value of the press. So overall in the region, while not every country has passed this kind of law, there are similar laws that form part of the state's growing arsenal of repressive laws. So if we address the question of which is a greater threat, is it anti-fake news law or the so-called dying press freedom in the region? But that's assuming that one does not feed into the other. When you have this kind of law, it forms part. It's of a piece with other laws that are meant to clamp down on the work of the media that at the very least undermines the work of legitimate media in the region. So broadly, the situation where repressive legislation is concerned, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, it would be an understatement to say that it is very bad, because there's been with the passage of these very repressive laws that are meant not only to stifle the media but also other independent voices in the region. The discussions would also naturally turn to, is fact-checking enough if we talk about the spread of fake news in the region and how it's undermining democracy? Interestingly, there's a growing consensus on the inadequacy of this kind of effort, and there's a need to go back to very basic stuff. At the very least, examining how journalists are doing their work and how they can regain public trust. Because one of the reasons for the spread of fake news is the growing mistrust in the media. That could be attributed to a host of factors, including systemic issues confronting media in the region, among which is the growing self-censorship, the concentration of media ownership, and other structural issues that would require in-depth understanding for us to be able to really determine how best to address the media landscape in the region and the growing disinformation disorder. I'll go into other points relating to how to address this maybe in the course of our discussion. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That really set the scene well from the media perspective. So over to you, Matthew.
Sure.
Maybe you'd like to also tell us a bit about what Article 19 actually does.
So Article 19 is a global human rights organization focused on the right to freedom of expression and the right to information. And I oversee the Asia program, doing work primarily in Southeast Asia. Gwen introduced the topic as critics say that these laws are being used to target journalists, and I think we're the critics, and that's probably the message you're going to hear from all of us. I think one important thing to keep in mind is that this is not a new problem. I mean, the term fake news is being used a lot more, exploited a lot more, but it's an old problem of disinformation. Just recently, in the last few days, I was listening to a podcast that was explaining the campaign of disinformation that was waged by Jefferson and Hamilton against each other in the early days of the American Republic. And some of the rhetoric and the dismay by people that were observing what they were doing to each other through co-opted media sounds very similar to what people are saying today about fake news. So this is an old problem. I think what's new is the form it's taking, and especially we're dealing with something that is very new in social media. And so some of this dismay and this concern, I think, is something we would expect in dealing with a completely new form of expression and media. And I think another point to draw from this idea that this is an old problem, these concerns about the way that media was operating in America in the decades right after American independence was also at the time when there were really important principles being established about press freedom. And I think it's important for us now as well, as we have this whole new idea and platforms with social media, to be similarly also trying to ground things in international law, in principles relating to democracy and human rights. All of that to say that we're critics of this problem. It's an old problem that's been dealt with before. That's not to say it's not a problem. Fake news is very clearly a problem, and it's a human rights problem. I mentioned that Article 19 not only works on freedom of expression, but the right to information. And the right to information, which is protected by international law, protects individuals' rights to seek information, to receive information, and the spread of fake news can violate that right. So this is very clearly a human rights problem. It's also a human rights problem in that fake news can contribute to violence and discrimination and other very serious human rights violations, as we've seen in Southeast Asia. That said, I think that sometimes the threat of fake news has been overblown and certainly has been politicized. Article 19 has done some work looking into academic or scientific studies, maybe sociological studies of the impact of fake news, and the first conclusion is that there's not much research yet, and there needs to be a lot more research. The preliminary findings are also fairly inconclusive. What's been found is that there's been a broad impact, meaning that a lot of people are seeing fake news, but in terms of changing political opinions, leading to action, the evidence isn't there. Now, these studies were done primarily in the West, in Europe or the United States, and I don't think there's been research in Southeast Asia that's similar. And obviously, there's very different contexts, which is important. So I think one of the points of action for civil society, for academics, should be to do similar research in Asia and see what actually is the impact. But what we have also been seeing is that the term fake news has been weaponized to undermine independent journalism and especially investigative journalism. Unfortunately, my president, Phil's president, Trump, has sort of spearheaded this effort and given a model of how to use the term fake news to try to undermine opponents and critics and journalists. But it's also a model that has been repeated in Southeast Asia. Very clearly, Duterte is doing this in the Philippines. The Myanmar government is doing this. I think we can recall the headlines that the Myanmar government was spreading about fake rape, trying to undermine the legitimacy of rape allegations by calling them fake and trying to link that to fake news efforts. So looking at these types of laws, the basic criticism, and I think the gist of what you're going to hear from all of us is we don't trust government or states to be the arbiter of truth. Human rights law, and then more broadly, principles about democracy or constitutionalism are really based on mistrust of the state. And it's not mistrust of any particular state, but mistrust of the state as an institution. That's why we have human rights law that is primarily aimed at limiting the power of states, and that's why good constitutions do the same thing. And so this mistrust of government, I think, is even more resonant in a region, but also just in a time where states are the primary propagators of misinformation. So we're seeing these initiatives in Southeast Asia, legislative initiatives that empower states to be the arbiters of what is true and what is not true, at the same time that they are actively engaged in misinformation campaigns. There's a lot of ways we see this. The Myanmar government, it's through state institutions. We see it through these sort of shady information bodies set up by militaries to discredit people, to spread lies, to target people. We see it through Twitter armies that are maybe set up privately, but that governments have started using and activating around election times. So the state institutions are spreading misinformation. It's very clear that they shouldn't be the arbiters of what is true and what is not true. But even if you assume a state that is benevolent, that is well-intentioned, and that is good at identifying false information, all of those would be very naive assumptions pretty much everywhere in the world and certainly in this region. But if you assume that, legislation to target fake news, to restrict so-called fake news or misinformation could still be problematic in that it stifles debate that should be allowed. People should be allowed to be wrong. I think in order to have engaged citizens, they have to feel that they have the freedom to express an opinion or to share a fact that turns out to be wrong. And so these laws, even if they were implemented with good purposes and implemented accurately, where they're actually being able to target factual falsehoods, can be problematic for that reason. I think there's another broader set of problems with these laws that are problems that we see in a lot of different types of laws. They often contain vague language, just terms, definitions of fake news that are overly broad and give a lot of discretion to authorities. They often have disproportionate penalties, very severe criminal penalties. And then also very problematic is the fact that they often involve intermediary liability, meaning not the one that's making the speech, but the website that's hosting it, the social media platform that's hosting it, the telecoms communication that's transmitting it. a lot of these laws are targeting those entities as well, and that's extremely problematic and goes against sort of developing human rights standards about these types of things. I'm sort of going to leave it to Kirsten to go into some of the more some of the details about the Singapore law, which I think is a very good example of a bad example of a law, a good example of a problematic law. The other major example from the region is Malaysia, and that's a country and a law that Article 19 has done a little bit more work on, and it demonstrates all of these flaws. I think they're very similar to the Singapore, the flaws with the Singapore law, so I think we can just allow Kirsten to speak for that. But what is interesting about the Malaysia law, I think maybe we should actually thank the past government for giving us a law and a process that was such a plain-faced effort to politicize the concept of fake news. It was a law that was passed a month before the election with a very clear political objective, which was to both put a chilling effect on the elections so that people felt fearful of speaking, and then also give the government the ability to target critics. And so the process in Malaysia was so transparently political that led to this law that it sort of gives us a very clear representation of what these laws are intended to do. I think I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer questions later.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Excellent rundown, and you're right, absolutely, about the effect of the Malaysian law and now the Singaporean law. And we have heard, and I think, Phil, you'll go into this, but there's now rumours that Thailand is working on such a law, inspired, no doubt, by Singapore and Malaysia. So anyway, over to you, Kirsten. If you could give us your views on the whole situation.
Yes. So just to give background about Singapore's law, so like as Matthew said, Malaysia's one was extremely transparent to the point that they called it the anti-fake news law. Singapore has gone the route, as we usually do, of making everything sound a little bit more administrative. So we called it the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, or in Singapore it's referred to as POFMA. To give background about what this law does, it allows any government minister, so not just like the Minister of Communications and Information, but any government minister in the cabinet, to order correction notices, to order takedowns, or to get internet service providers or internet intermediaries to block access. So a correction notice could be something like, they wouldn't ask you to take down the article, but they would demand that you post something on, like, at the top of the article that says, you know, this article, the veracity of this article has been disputed. For the accurate story, go to, and then like a link that the government would specify. And the government would specify the wording of this correction. So you don't get to draft your own correction. You basically print what the government tells you to print. And all this would be through executive action. So the minister simply issues the order. He doesn't need to go to the court. He doesn't need to get a warrant. He doesn't need to get any sort of judge to look at what he thinks is real. Like, is it real or false? He just issues this order as long as he thinks that the statement is false and he thinks it's in the public interest to act. And under the law, we have very, very broad definitions of what is considered a false statement of facts and what is considered in the public interest. So under our law, it says a false statement is a statement that is false or misleading. And that's it. Right? That's the definition of what is false under Singapore's law. And public interest can extend to all sorts of things from, you know, apart from the national security, it extends to preserving public tranquility, preserving friendly relations between Singapore and other countries, and also alarmingly to things like preserving public confidence in government institutions. So it's already from the outset very, very broad. When the minister makes an order, you have to comply, even if you want to eventually appeal to the High Court you would have to comply with the order first, because otherwise there are heavy fines and even jail terms if you don't comply. I think for individuals, the jail terms can go up to 10 years. And so there was a lot of criticism about how this is really overly broad. It's a huge amount of state overreach. It holds social media companies as internet intermediaries responsible as well. So if they don't want to issue an individual the order, they can issue the order to Twitter or Facebook to say, issue a correction or take down this or block access to this. And if those companies don't comply, there's fines as well, like up to $1 million for these companies. It also allows government to declare websites a declared online location, which would bar you from getting funding. So no advertising, no subscriptions, no donations. And the idea of, well, ostensibly it's to defund like content, like troll farms and content mills from putting out fake news, but it could be used in so many other ways because of how broad this law is. And we've seen that, the People's Action Party in Singapore are not the most conservative when they want to call things fake news. Like they've called Human Rights Watch report fake news. That is kind of the standard that we have seen. Other issues that we do worry about is that the way this law is drafted, it's solely in one direction. So governments declaring things fake news, taking action. If the government is in itself responsible for putting out misinformation or disinformation, this law does not provide citizens an avenue to seek redress. So if I felt that the government was putting out something false about me and they were running a smear campaign, there was no way that I could use this law to get that sort of misinformation taken down, right? Like I could technically write like a petition to a minister to say, can you issue an order against your colleague? But how likely are they to do that? Like that's not feasible. In fact, the government insists that there's due process because you can take the case to the High Court. But how feasible is it for Singaporeans who have been issued an order to, correct or take down a Facebook post to say, no, I'm going to take the government to court? Knowing the political climate of Singapore, that's very unlikely to happen. And so what this law would allow would be for government ministers to essentially become arbiters of truth. And that's an example that we really don't want the rest of the region to follow. But unfortunately, as you were saying, it sounds like Thailand might be mulling something over. Unfortunately, Singapore has this very outsized reputation internationally and is seen as the place that gets stuff done and seen as the place where there's rule of law. And so our passing this legitimizes it for a lot of other contexts as well.
Right. Thanks very much, Kirsten. We'll come back to you on that. I think you raised some very good points, and it's very good to have that specific detail on Singapore. And now we're segueing to Phil, who's going to give us a much broader view. It would be good also if you could give us that whole big picture of Asia generally, but maybe if you've got some idea of the context as well, and how it fits with what we're getting out of America, and in fact,
thank you very much for having me. I'm Phil Roberts with Human Rights Watch, and as I was thinking about what to talk about today, when it comes to freedom of information expression, a lot of people forget that before the internet, that the ASEAN governments almost completely controlled all the news and information that their people saw. TV, radio, local language, print media, local language publications, all of it was basically controlled before the internet. And they could, if they saw something they didn't like, you wouldn't invite somebody who was an opponent, but you could, flip the switch off and on the TV and radio. You don't give a publication a license to print. That was happening regularly for many years. But with the rise of the internet, you started to see a real bifurcation of the regional media scene. you saw online newspapers like Malaysia Kini in Malaysia or Prachatai in Thailand or the Online Citizen in Singapore come up, and as internet speeds increased, you saw internet radio and TV as well, and the governments realized that they were losing control. And I think actually some of what we're seeing here is about governments trying to take back control. They didn't like the fact that all of a sudden with this online publishing that you could have real investigative journalism and you could get it published. They didn't like that, journalists didn't have to take government jobs to become a journalist, that they could, be independent. That people could become bloggers like they are in Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam Facebookers and bloggers who are popular have hundreds of thousands of followers. It is an online publishing platform, and it's an alternative view. And oftentimes when we see people get cracked down on for blogging, it's because they become enough of an opinion leader that the government gets concerned about it. And so I think, in some ways we should be thinking about what has not changed. And what has not changed is that many of these Southeast Asian governments, if they could snap their fingers and go back to that kind of previous information control they had before the internet came up, that they would do that. And the problem is, for a long time, for them, the problem was that they thought it was impossible. They didn't have the capacity to censor a block. The people who were working online were often able to get people to do workarounds around blocks by the government. Others, like for instance in Thailand here, were basically afraid of backlash by netizens. I mean, everybody remembers when Prayut tried to say that he was going to shut down Facebook, and within a day there was so much outrage in Thailand that he immediately backed off. And censorship looks a little bit bad online, going after a single individual. So I think what we've seen is, a real focus on how do we get back control? How do we get control of the information environment? And now, thanks to Donald Trump and the Singaporean government, using the rhetoric of combating fake news, these governments can censor while all the same time masquerading as agents of truth, referees of fairness, and protectors of the citizenry. And with the anti-fake news law, I think the problem is that Singapore is proudly showing the governments the path to get back to that kind of information control that they want. For those of you who are Star Wars fans, this is the Empire Strikes Back episode. These governments have been trying to figure out how to put the internet genie back in the bottle for a while, and I think the Singapore fake news law is going to be the new model for the region. Now, we just had the ASEAN summit here. I will bet you that, this discussion was going on in the halls, that, hey, we heard about this fake news law that you've got, what's it all about, Singapore? And, when it comes to bad human rights practice, I've often compared ASEAN to like a kindergarten, because what happens is one kid gets sick and shows up, and then all the kids get sick. What we have seen, and already it's starting to come out, that, Cambodia is looking at this. Thailand is looking at this. And this is the conversation I had actually with a senior representative of one of the big social media companies, that this thing in Singapore is going to be the model to copy. And once that the dictators of the region realize that they can arbitrarily decide what is fake and what is misleading, and then use the law to enforce that this is the new censorship, except it will be called going after fake news. And of course, Hun Sen, never one to be slow off the block, is one of the first people to be looking at this. This is the guy who destroyed the opposition using claims of a color revolution that didn't exist. And he was just opening the 16th Asia Media Summit of the Asia Pacific Institute for Broadcasting Development. Now, you may ask, what is the Asia Pacific Institute for Broadcasting Development? I didn't know either until they decided to hold a big summit in Angkor Wat and invite Hun Sen to talk about press freedom. Needless to say, his idea of press freedom is talking about fake news. And, it became quite clear, listening to Q Kanarat, the Cambodia's Minister of Information, others, that this is now on the agenda. And the attendees at this meeting, which is primarily state broadcasters, so, you know, Mass Communications Organization of Thailand, or Bernama from Malaysia, or Vietnam News Agency, or what have you, they decided that they're going to launch what they call the Angkor Fake News Initiative. And there's going to be an Asia-Pacific roadmap to combat fake news, according to the Minister of Information. So we're already launched on this situation here. You know, so who's going to be taking part of this? Well, I mean, I'm sure the Tatmadaw True News Information Team from Myanmar, you know, who have had us believe that the Rohingya were burning their own houses until Jonathan Head caught them basically making it up, you know, who said there were no human rights violations committed against the Rohingya, no rape, no sexual violence. I'm sure that they will be ready to participate. You know, we have Thailand's Ministry of Digital Economy and Society, who are purportedly now looking at this at very senior levels. You know, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, you know, he has been calling any sort of differences in the numbers of killed in the drug war to be fake news. Vietnam has been attacking anybody who says there are human rights violations in Vietnam as fake news. I'm fully expecting that we will have, within the course of the next year or so, a significant number of new fake news laws either passed or in process. And, you know, as I said to this senior social media person, I said, you know, this is the beginning of info wars. Info wars between the governments and the citizenry about, like, what constitutes fake news or not. It's going to be a new form of censorship. You know, it's very interesting in the international system, as Matt was mentioning, human rights are supposed to be protected by governments. You know, we call them the duty bearers. They're the ones in the UN system who are supposed to guarantee human rights. But in fact, oftentimes, we spend more time expecting the governments to do the wrong thing. And unfortunately, in this situation, it looks like we're not going to be disappointed. The problem is also, you know, one of the countries, the United States, where freedom of the press is guaranteed in the Constitution, and also you can't really have criminal defamation because it's guaranteed in the Constitution. You know, this has now become the biggest purveyor of the fake news myth, that somehow this is a major, deadly, dire crisis for the world. I mean, what you have is, you know, Donald Trump calling anything he disagrees with to be fake news. And the problem is, he's calling it fake news, and everybody knows that, you know, what he's saying is really him making it up. But the thing is, these governments are now going to operationalize that. And if you look at the grant of authority within that Singapore law, it is something to behold. I mean, you basically have a minister who is going to be able to determine what is false and misleading, and cannot be challenged until you already implement what is required. Let's give an example. Let's say an Article 19 report is written about Singapore. Not a Human Rights Watch report, an Article 19 report. And the minister doesn't like it. He says it's fake news. And he requires that there be an extensive correction put up to deal with this. Everywhere in the internet that any mention of this report occurs will be required to put up a correction notice. So let's say Matt makes a video about the report, and it gets shared by 10,000 people on YouTube. YouTube is going to be required to put up a correction notice in each place that it occurs. And if 20,000 people share it on Facebook, a correction notice has to come up. Now, what you're talking about is you're talking about tracking who is sharing what and who is communicating with who on the internet. You're talking about a direct sort of assault on the issue of privacy on the internet. Even though you're doing it publicly, no one's tracking every single thing you're doing. I mean, maybe Google is, right? But they're just trying to make money out of it. But the issue is governments who are tracking these things can put you in prison, or they can fine you. So what we're talking about here is not only censorship, but also a grave invasion of privacy. And and even though I think some of these social media companies are right now talking big about how they're going to protect freedom of expression, things like that, if they are in fact expected to put up notices on something, 50,000 times it appears on their platform, it's going to be much easier for them to just say, well, let's just take it down. And then the governments will have won. So, that's what we're looking at. That same media representative was saying, well, we can challenge these things in the courts and we have the resources to do it. But he also said, but, what happens if Cambodia passes a law like this? The Cambodian courts, come on. Vietnam courts? Myanmar courts? They cannot expect that they're going to get any sort of free or fair consideration from those courts, because those courts are frankly politically controlled. They're not independent, as the Reuters journalists found out in Myanmar. And as people find out, we just had someone, a journalist, in prison for 2 years today in Cambodia, Rat Moni. So, what we're looking at is sort of information Armageddon, unless something's done.
Right. Thank you for that very sobering, grim outlook, Phil. Actually, just to pick up, and I'd be interested if any of you want to respond to anything that any of you said, but let me just ask something, given what you've all said, and I completely agree. I think that when governments themselves become part of the problem or perpetrators of misinformation, fake news, that is a real problem. Also, when the arbiter of what is fake or not fake is politically co-opted legal system, that is also a huge problem. But on the other side, we've seen some shocking ethno-religious violence triggered by outrageously fake reports, particularly in India and recently in Nigeria and other places, and even the Indonesian elections recently. Jokowi was targeted by some, patently false reports about accusing him of all kinds of things, which I think probably significantly affected the margin of vote, although he still won. So we're seeing lots of examples of, on the flip side, not state-sponsored fake news, but all kinds of politically motivated fake news by very dark forces. What do we do then does anyone have an answer or a proposal about, if you can't rely on courts, we don't want sort of a proper regulatory legal regime that will put people in jail for this stuff. What are the options? Matthew?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. First of all, there's a lot of things that can be done that are short of censoring speech or using criminal sanctions. The first thing that governments need to be doing, and especially governments in this region, is promoting a media sector that is independent, that is diverse, that is free to operate. And that's the best antidote to fake news, is good journalism and being allowed to share facts. And what the governments in the region, by and large, are doing is the opposite. They're censoring, they're targeting investigative journalists, creating media environments that are not diverse or pluralistic. People feel under threat if they do expose the truth. So that's just sort of the base starting point. Governments can also have a role in promoting digital literacy, public service media, broader efforts to promote equality and non-discrimination. This is actually the area where we see a lot of misinformation and fake news. All of that to say that that doesn't mean that legislation that addresses falsehoods is per se illegitimate. There is a place for both legislative responses and criminal sanction, but it's very, very limited under international law. And these are particularly cases that arise to incitement to violence or discrimination. And international law says that those forms of speech must be restricted. But if you take like these fake news laws that we're seeing in the region, and you chip away the things that are in violation of international law, you get left with this little nugget, which is where you could actually apply these laws in conformity with international law. And the fact is they're already covered by other criminal provisions. You don't need a new law. There are incitement provisions in penal codes and sedition provisions, and a lot of these that are also too broad. But in almost every case in Southeast Asia, there's a criminal code and existing criminal laws that are sufficient to address these most grievous cases that amount to incitement. And so I think government should be strengthening that response, but it's largely strengthening political will to apply these laws to address the very clear instances of incitement, rather than creating this new set of laws that is way too broad and is not necessary, and to the extent that it is necessary is just duplicative.
Right. Thanks, Matthew.
I would
Phil,
just,
and then maybe over to you, Kirsten, if you have a point, or Tess.
Can I just add that, following up that point that Matt just made, the one place where we actually see some progress is in Malaysia, where actually there was a fake news law passed. It has now been revoked by the Mahathir government, the Pakatan Harapan government. At least in the lower house, there's been a vote. We're expecting that it will be completely and totally revoked later this year when the Pakatan Harapan government takes control of the Senate. There's a number of reasons why the Senate is not controlled by them yet, but it will be. It's basically senators rotating off and new people being appointed. But it was quite clear that when that law was passed by then former Prime Minister Najib and his government, that it was going to be used as a political weapon. And it was pretty clear from the debate in the parliament that was what was the plan. And the only reason we were saved from that is because Mahathir and that team won the election instead of Najib.
Right. Yes, Tess, please.
I think what's lost in the discourse is what's really stoking the spread of disinformation in the region. And you'll need to be looking at a host of systemic issues if you really want to come up with effective solutions to this kind of problem. Among others, we need to be looking at what drives public distrust in the media that makes them more susceptible to receiving false news. We need to be looking at how best do we do media literacy, for example. Should we be expanding the definition of media literacy so that you're not just looking at, making people understand how journalists are supposed to do their work, but you also need to be looking at this against the backdrop of what's happening in your country, where there's creeping authoritarianism, for example, or strongman rule, as in the case of the Philippines. It's difficult to discuss these kinds of problems without looking broadly at what's really going on, where as far as the political realities confronting your country are concerned. In the Philippines, for example, definitely our government, I come from the Philippines, is no less than our president, is a purveyor of fake news. But he still remains very popular. And what he says, there's still a lot of, applause for the kinds of shocking pronouncements that he makes. And when he says this Rappler report is fake news, people just latch onto it. And why? He's popular. People still believe him. Still see him as our savior. I mean, given all the problems confronting our country, corruption, poverty, and all. So it's difficult to be looking at this independent of other issues confronting the country. so that, and the public needs to be part of the discussion. The public needs to understand what's really going on. It's difficult to just, get the public to understand what fake news is and how do you combat fake news without getting them to understand the issues confronting your country, so that you're not just looking at it, without looking at other issues. So the discourse has to be expanded to include all these other structural issues. People have to understand that media cannot avoid coming up with false information, but it doesn't mean we are purveyors of fake news. There are protocols to ensure that the information we put out is accurate. And that's what sets us apart from social media, where the content is really user-generated and they have no editors, they have no second or third pairs of eyes looking at, information being uploaded. So my point is, it's difficult to be coming up with measures to address these issues without getting the public to understand. And the media also should need to understand what's really confronting us as a country or as a region. It's interesting that in Indonesia, for example, 4 media organizations are proposing coming up with regulation to combat negative content. And one of which is the Indonesian Press Council. And I was reading and I was wondering, why? Why would you propose a measure like that when you should be at the forefront of understanding, what is likely to violate free speech? So even the media, it seems, needs some education.
Right. But you talk about education. How do you propose that this happens? That's the point. Who takes the responsibility, or what kind of mechanisms?
Different sectors have to be involved. You need to start in schools, for example. Get the church to be involved, for instance. It cannot be just the media or civil society defenders. It has to be a broad-based coalition responding to these issues. Mm-hmm. Not just civil society, not just human rights defenders, but the church, the academia, schools, because the problems are so deep-seated that just getting Human Rights Watch, for example, or Southeast Asian Press Alliance to address to these issues will not go so far.
Right. Thank you. Kirsten, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think,
Could you speak up a little bit? It's sort of slightly unclear how the sound's coming through, but anyway. Oops. I think we've lost her.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. We lost you for a moment. Start again.
Okay, yeah. So, we've talked about how,
maybe speak a little louder, I think.
To become the arbiters of truth. But I think it is worth acknowledging that social media platforms have failed in very big ways and spectacular ways. That was very much evident when Singapore's government was going through the motions of bringing in this fake news law. So before they introduced the bill and they passed the bill, the year before, last year, they had a select committee that was meant to be getting public feedback about what to do with the bill, with fake news. They said it, they were just getting feedback, even though there was a sense that they already wanted a law. And one of the things that they used was all the ways that social media platforms have failed. And so we went into these open hearings by the select committee where they would say, look at this terrible thing in Myanmar where a false story about rape triggered a riot. Isn't that terrible? Shouldn't we do something about that? Shouldn't we have measures that would stop this sort of bloodshed, stemming from misinformation and disinformation online? They use Cambridge Analytica and a whole host of Facebook failures to basically paint social media companies as being either unwilling, untrustworthy, or unable to uphold standards and therefore justify the government stepping in. And so it is also important to note that there are ways that social media companies can do much better and not give these governments the excuse to say, oh, you clearly can't do it, so we have to do it for you. As Matthew says in Article 19, says that there is international human rights law that big tech companies can look at to structure their community standards. Because at the moment, one of the big problems is that their community standards are really confusing. They differ from platform to platform. People don't really know how they work. There's not a lot of transparency about how they're applied. Sometimes people get locked out of their Facebook accounts or their Twitter accounts, and they don't know why. They don't know if it's political or if it's some sort of glitch in the system, and it just throws up a lot of confusion about how it works. And so there can be a lot more transparency and a lot more participation of local civil societies who know the context to help these social media companies uphold their own community standards and, give governments less excuse to say that they have to step in. With media literacy, I think Tess is right. We cannot divorce that from the political context of the country or what's happening, and that media literacy needs to come with political education as well. People need to understand how the politics works in their country. For example, the Straits Times, which I'm sure everyone knows is the main broadsheet in Singapore, they are now offering media literacy classes on how to spot fake news. They are charging people 648 Singapore dollars for a one-day workshop on how to spot fake news. And, on the face of it sounds great. Like, yeah, it's great. A mainstream media newspaper is holding media literacy classes. Media literacy is fantastic. In the Singapore context, it is it's kind of weird that, the Straits Times of all papers is teaching people how to spot fake news, because one of the big problems is that people should learn how to read the Straits Times more critically. And so, it really can't be divorced from, I think, political education as well. People need to understand the context, because a lot of misinformation and disinformation also thrives off the fact that people don't understand context.
Right. I think, you've got another person on the panel here. Yes. I think there might be a good story in finding out how popular the Singapore Straits Times fake news spotting classes might be at $620, did you say? For how long?
648 Singapore
Right.
dollars.
We could offer free ones at the press club, or maybe for a much lower price than that. So there's a great commercial opportunity out of fake news, folks. If maybe Human Rights Watch and Article 19 should start some classes on. But incidentally, that does lead me to raise the fact that I think the US Embassy itself has financed various journalists, I think Thai journalist groups, taken them to America and sponsored a project where they came up with a handbook for Thai media, I don't know if you've seen that, called how to fact-checking and how to spot fake news. So, these are the kind of educational efforts you're talking about. But I think when you propose, we need more education and public awareness, but you also need someone authoritative to take ownership of that and have a coordinated... you'll end up with 50 different approaches on what is one person's definition of fake news is another person's, very different view. But to move the discussion on before we take some questions, maybe just one last question to you all. I think Tessa raised a very good point about this distinction between social media, including citizen journalism, right? So any citizen, your mum, anyone can tweet something or post something which is akin to a news report that I saw the, old man next door abusing the little girl on the other side. And before you know it, the guy's lynched. This can be a power of any citizen these days. And the difference between professional media, which are more bound by ethics and, let's say, a certain set of rules, industry rules, as well as, some regulation, I guess, press councils and the like, and you've got bloggers and tweeters and, ordinary people who are not bound by any rules. So, I think one question is, in all the issues we're discussing, is there a one-size... Are we lumping all this in together? Is there a one-size-fits-all approach, or do we sort of define our approaches between, not just ordinary citizens, but politically motivated people who are not professional journalists and professional journalists who are paid to be journalists in mainstream media? Is there a difference in how we should approach those things?
I think there are certain approaches, at least in the context of Southeast Asia, that could apply to much, if not the entire region. For example, media should be very discerning in how it does its work. At the very least, I think it's time for some self-introspection in how we do our job. Because if the public does not, if the kinds of stories that journalists, for example, produce do not resonate with the public, what is there for people to appreciate the value of the kind of work that we do? So naturally, they would turn to social media. And already in Asia, the main source of news is social media, and it's not good. When I say certain approaches could apply across the region, media should be mindful of how we do our work. There's certainly a need to improve our skills, because if you're doing sloppy work, people don't appreciate your stories, and again, they would turn to more entertaining stuff. For example, more content that would have some emotional value, for example. But there's also a need to contextualize the approach. What would work for Myanmar might not work for the Philippines, simply because the realities are different. And therefore, we need to be mindful of the specific contexts where the spread of disinformation is happening. And this is where we need to engage people in discussions, in conversations, in terms of how best to approach these kinds of issues. And people would have different ideas as to how to approach this. So there's a need to contextualize, but at the same time, there are, again, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, at least based on what we're seeing, certain measures, I think, would be valuable for much, if not the entire region, in terms of solutions to this, to the scourge of disinformation.
Right. So that's actually yet another division that you've raised, which is regional, country-specific approaches. We've got, different types of media. I mean, how much should we nuance it or, refine or specialize our approaches?
I think it's important to recognize that the people who are trying to spread false information, and I think about Land Destroyer. This is a website network that, of course, is attacking various different people. They've attacked the press club here, saying that they've taken money from the National Endowment for Democracy, things like that. There's a number of different sort of players and groups who are deliberately trying to purvey a certain narrative that is destructive. And actually, it's interesting to look, when you look at who was the one who alerted Facebook to the hate speech against the Rohingya and against the non-Rohingya Muslims in other parts of Myanmar, it was civil society. And in fact, what they were doing is they were calling on the phone that Facebook had provided, or the communication network that Facebook had provided. No one was answering the phone until it finally got to a situation where it was so bad that it got into the press, and then it reached Mark Zuckerberg. So you have civil society, you have various groups who are prepared to do things to try to spot these kind of fake news narratives going out. I know that people are talking about digital literacy and things like that, and that there's a lot of initiatives that be done on that. But from a practical point of view, this is like emptying the ocean with a bucket. The reality is that there's so many people out there that you're not going to get to everybody. And people are going to believe these things. So what you have to do is you have to have people who are prepared to debunk this. And this is actually the things that Facebook and these others are starting to do, is they're actually hiring fact verification organizations to look at these things. It's labor intensive. It's not as fast as you want, but they're actually trying to do that. The problem is that if the governments come in and start saying that we're going to be the ultimate arbiter of what is fake news, you're going to have politically driven decisions that will be based on what the government wants rather than what is factually true.
Right.
And that is a fundamental problem. I'll give you an example here from Singapore, Human Rights Watch. There was a submission done by the ruling parties, the PAP policy division, to this committee in the parliament, basically claiming that our report about freedom of expression violations and media freedom violations in Singapore, which was a very comprehensive report that we did, was fake news. They just said the whole thing was fake news. This is from the ruling party of the government. When we sent them a letter before we published saying, we're publishing a report about Singapore, here are our questions we'd like to have you answer, they didn't answer. And then they attacked us saying, you guys won't appear in front of our committee. And we were like, yeah, because it's a politically motivated committee. We're not going to show up for that. What are you talking about? I'm not going to sit there and let the minister of law basically beat me up because, you think that you guys have got the whole discussion of the truth and that you're the arbiters of the truth. Sorry. We know where this is going. And the reality is this is what the governments want. The governments are more interested in their narratives than they are in the truth.
Right. Thanks, Phil. Good points. We've got time for a few questions. Dominic, did you raise your pinky over there? Please identify yourself.
Dominic Fulder, Nikkei Asian Review. It seems to me that this debate's a little bit lopsided and we're all talking about fake news and worrying about it tremendously, but actually we should be worrying about the fact that nobody wants to read real news or pay for it. And that's where the real crisis is.
But Dominic, that's not the subject.
No, it is the subject, I think,
right.
Because I strongly feel that fake news is a huge problem, but it's a big problem because the genuine media is so vulnerable. Okay, so government legislation is adding to that. But anyway, what would the committee like to...
But are you suggesting that there's more fake news as a result of people being reluctant to pay for real news, that they are going to sources like free sources?
I think fake news is as old as the hills.
Yes.
I mean, it
yeah.
goes
It's
back
misinformation,
to biblical times.
disinformation.
Yeah, so there's nothing new about that.
Yeah.
But it's become not disproportionately, but much more influential because the traditional media is so flawed and weakened. I mean, for goodness sake, on Friday, The Nation is going to stop printing. This is a disaster for Thailand.
Some may differ, but anyway.
Sorry, but anyway, what does the panel think of that?
But what's the question?
The question is, are we getting too obsessed with fake news and ignoring the real problem is that the genuine news is not being collected, it's not being paid for, people are not subscribing to publications, to news organisations, and therefore this whole thing is sliding downhill very dramatically.
Right.
Is that not the bigger problem?
I don't think I have an answer to your question, but I'm responding to say I understand the question and sort of agree with the assertion of the problem. Article 19 takes a lot of different approaches to promoting freedom of expression, and some of them are different than the way that the focus on research and advocacy that Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International would have. And we are in different parts of the world, including a project that we may be partnering with some other people in Myanmar shortly, trying to figure out what are better revenue models for independent media. But I've not been directly involved in those projects, and I haven't heard of groundbreaking ideas that are going to solve a problem that no one else has solved yet. So I think you're absolutely right in asserting that that's a big part of the problem. The lack of a revenue model for traditional media, for journalists that can draw a salary from journalism, is leading to a paucity of good independent journalism. Article 19, as I said, we're trying to work on that problem where we find that we're able to have more leverage is there's problems with independent media that are caused by states, and an advocacy model that Human Rights Watch or Article 19 or Amnesty or SEPA would use is we find more leverage in trying to roll back laws and policies that are targeting independent journalism, and we haven't come up with that answer for how to deal with the revenue model question. But I certainly see it as contributing to the problem.
Tess.
I think I'll answer that this way. Yeah. People still value good information. And when we say good information, at least in the case of journalistic work, journalistic stories, independently verified, factual information, even as people are increasingly turning to social media as sources of news, however people define news, I think there's still a lot of there are still many people who could tell, at least the more discerning ones, which is good information and which is not, which is reliable information and which is not, and it's still essentially the media, the legacy media, that could be relied upon to provide that kind of information. I think of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, for example, and this was shared with me by the executive director, who came out with a series of stories on the assets, wealth of the Duterte family, meaning including the daughter who's mayor of the city where he used to be local chief executive, and 2 other sons. And these are well-crafted stories, and people, at least this was what was shared to me, people responded very positively to those kinds of stories, because people could see the effort that went into putting together those stories. The comments were well thought out, meaning people read the stories, people believed the stories, people value the stories. I think this is an example of media, stepping up to the challenge of providing information that will make people appreciate once again the value of good information. But the part of the problem is many of us in the media are not living up to the challenge given the quality of work that we put out. And this is again part of what we need to be looking into if we're exploring solutions to the kinds of issues that we're talking about. I don't know how to answer that question, which is a bigger problem. To us, the problem is so complex that we need to be able to ensure that basic freedoms, that the right of people to information is upheld, is protected at all times, and this translates into ensuring that people get the information that they need to, because there's no question about our need for well-informed citizenry in the region.
Thank you. Question? Yes, please. Identify yourself.
Peter Trainer. I'm a club member and resident in Bangkok. I just wanted to ask the panel about 2 things, about scale and about motivation. You referred to early American presidents spreading fake news about each other. Previously, there were very few news outlets. There weren't many newspapers or newspaper proprietors or politicians behind them. So the people tended to trust the news media because there was nothing else that they had, and there wasn't very much of it. Currently, you've got millions of local, national, and international bloggers and media platforms that have a lot of followers. So there's a totally different scale of news that's being pumped out. Whether it's fake or not, it's almost impossible for people to find out. People can't do their own fact checking. Whereas previously, they would trust the media because, like I say, there was no other source of information. So there's no reason not to believe it. That's what was printed. So the scale of the problem has changed, and it's getting bigger and bigger. The other question that I've got is motivation. The Chairman Mao could tell the Chinese people that the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution was the best thing that ever happened because he had the only mouthpiece. So people didn't know that in terms of news, they didn't hear anything else. But they knew they were starving to death and there was famine. And what the news that they were getting wasn't true. The same as Stalin could say that Russian production was much better than the previous 5-year plan projected it would be, but they were still starving and there was nothing in the shops and they couldn't buy anything. So what was the motivation, or what is currently the motivation for the leaders, the governments, to tell people stuff which is obviously not true? In the fake news, the people can see day to day that what they're being told, a lot of it, isn't true, because they've got eyes and they've got incomes which don't match what the politicians are telling them it should be. They've got blatant lies coming to them, like you quoted about the Rohingya. Anybody who lived in that area or who saw any news about that area knew that what the government was saying wasn't true, so it discredits the government. So what's the motivation for the governments to do things that will discredit them? They just don't care. So the scale and the motivation, what's the panel's opinion of their impact?
What's the panel's opinion about what, sorry?
About the scale of the problem,
right,
and the motivation why the governments will perpetuate lies that people can see are lies.
I mean, I would say in terms of scale, I mean, I'm still puzzled why, like, you know, people talking about what they had for lunch gets like 50,000 views on YouTube, and something that like about human rights gets about 30. You know, but I mean, the issue to me, I think, is that, you know, the scale of social media and the ability to watch things online rather than, you know, reading a newspaper. I mean, we've just had a generational shift. I mean, so we have to now basically come up with mechanisms that can fact check and provide alternative information online. I mean, I think this is, you know, we have to go where the eyes are going at this point, and the eyes are clearly going into issues of social media and YouTube and things like that. You know, can you set up a place where verified information has been placed? Can you set up something where, you know, things have been fact checked? You know, is there a way that like the various social media companies can work together, you know, in fact checking and things like that? I mean, I think, you know, part of it, I mean, what we're going to see is the social media companies, the Twitter, Googles, Instagrams, and others are now going to come under a lot more pressure on the whole sort of fake news agenda. And the question is, what are they prepared to do? Are they prepared to step up and try to defend freedom of expression, or are they going to cave in and become part of the problem, become part of the censorship? And I'm not sure yet. To be honest, I'm not sure. I mean, I talk to some people and I think, okay, you know, they're gonna work on freedom of expression. I talk to other people and they're like, I'm thinking, okay, this is profit motive only. And as soon as it comes to making a decision, they're gonna drop the freedom of expression and go for the money.
Mm. Okay, thank you.
I think for the if I could take the two questions together. So for the Singapore context, I'm not sure that the problem that people are not paying for traditional news, because you know, our mainstream media, the traditional news, the newspapers still have, you know, they still kind of conquer the market in that way, because, you know, if you don't subscribe to the Straits Times, what are you going to subscribe to, right? Like, there's just not a lot out there in Singapore. And these papers, like, so the Singapore Press Holdings is still in the black, you know, where a lot of other news companies around the world are struggling. So we don't necessarily have that issue. I think we have an issue more of trust that's very difficult to define in, like, you know, reports and surveys, because you look at reports and it says trust in government is high and trust in the media is high, but it is like a brewing issue. People, even if they are subscribing, they might not feel like the Straits Times or mainstream media represents them, or it might not feel like the mainstream media is telling them everything that they need to know. And then they turn to online sources, and then it becomes a question of, if you don't trust the mainstream media and you turn to the online sources, how well equipped are you with media literacy to figure out which sources you want to look at? And also then it would be difficult to distinct, like I wouldn't kind of try to have differentiated responses based on, oh, are you a professional journalist or are you just a blogger? I think that has to do with my background. So like, for example, when I first started in journalism, I was not a trained journalist. I was a blogger. 10 years ago, I would not be a journalist today if it wasn't for social media and the internet. You know, it might not even have occurred to me that that's something that I would want to do. So, you know, in a lot of spaces like Singapore, like Vietnam, these citizen journalists and bloggers, untrained though we might have been at the beginning, are crucial sources of information, are crucial sources of, you know, pushing for accountability and transparency in small ways. For Singapore, for the second question, I'm not so confident that the government would be pushing lies that people can see are lies. What we have in Singapore is a situation of huge asymmetry in who has information and data on anything. So we don't have any right to freedom of information. There is no Freedom of Information Act as with many other countries in Southeast Asia. So I think if the government controls the narrative, there are a lot of things that they can say that would be difficult for people to really know the truth of. So they could say, you know, for example, and this has happened to me, I report on migrant workers and then I say, you know, a lot of migrant workers are exploited in Singapore, and then the ministry writes to my editor and goes, well, you know, that can't possibly be true because we have this survey that says 9 out of 10 migrant workers are very happy to be where they are. And then they'll say, oh, and then, you know, therefore the 3 workers that you quoted in your piece must be the minority. You're not talking to the right people. It's not representative. That's what they said of Human Rights Watch report as well, right? They said like, oh, Human Rights Watch spoke to 30 people. That's not representative of, you know, the 3 million Singaporeans or whatever it is. And the government has so much monopoly over data that I think they are able to set the agenda and the narratives in that way, which is why a law like POFMA makes it worse. Right. Because there's even less accountability, there's even less transparency. And my fear is that it will become counterproductive because it will only breed more distrust and more polarization, like political polarization, because if the government uses this law against somebody who's seen as a critic, are people going to be, oh, that's the government safeguarding the truth, the government must be right, or are they more likely to say the government's trying to cover up something and become even more suspicious and perhaps more susceptible to turning to even more dodgy sources on social media who are claiming, you know, they're showing you the real story that the government once hushed up.
Right.
And so it could actually backfire in that way.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. And lastly, perhaps Richard, please identify.
My name's Richard Barrow. My question is simple. Do you believe there is a fake news problem in Thailand? And if so, who do you think are the worst offenders, the government itself or people from the private sector? And as a follow-up question, what is your solution to fake news? What should happen?
Well, that's really easy. I mean...
We'll start on that one.
Okay.
No.
Number one, number 2, number 3.
Well, I would say that I think that there is a fake news problem in Thailand. There's a couple different sources. I mean, the government's a big source. I mean, you know, we're dealing with a military government here that is now what I call sock puppet democracy. You know, we have a government that is now got the military in control through a democratic process. The reality is that we have seen continually that, you know, the NCPO, they would say something was white and it had to be white, even if it was black. The reality is that there's not a lot of truth going on from the current crop of power holders in Thailand. I would say also that there was also fake news coming from, going back to, like, for instance, the red shirts. I remember very clearly when we launched our report about the crackdown on the red shirts, we had both the government and the red shirts angry at us. The government was angry at us because we basically showed evidence that the military had been killing unarmed civilians. And so they denied that and they said that's fake. Then we had the red shirts angry at us because we showed evidence that there were actually black shirt paramilitaries also operating, shooting at government forces. They said, no, there's no black shirts. What you had here was a denial of any narrative that didn't fit with what they thought was the political narrative they wanted to come across. And that is something that, unfortunately, has been endemic in Thai politics. But then there's others, who have been attacking civil society. This whole land destroyer group. We continually see them coming up on Twitter and Facebook and things like that, and they're attacking anything that's pro-human rights, anything that's, talking about democracy or participation. Everything is a left-wing CIA plot. And so, we've had that for a long time. That anything that certain groups don't like that is perceived as coming from an American source is CIA. And, most of the time you just laugh at it. But the problem is if you have something repeated enough, there are a certain percentage of people who are going to believe it. And, that's why, having independent verification or having some sort of sources of information where you could say this has been fact-checked would be quite helpful. But a lot of people aren't even going to read that. They're just going to read what they saw on Facebook, and they're going to believe that. Right. The other thing I think to also mention, the governments are starting to also think about going after encrypted messaging.
Are you talking about Thailand?
Not about Thailand. I'm talking about Singapore and India and others.
Right.
Who are basically saying that fake news is being spread through, for instance, WhatsApp chats or other chats, and therefore they're demanding that these providers must provide access to encrypted chats. So far, this has been pushed back, simply because it's not technically feasible, and also because you'd be compromising encryption across the world. But I think that we'll eventually face that challenge as well.
Right. Thanks. That question was about Thailand. To finish off, does anyone have any other view on Thailand, where we are sitting now and will undoubtedly be coping with more of these issues in coming months, if not years? Right. Tess.
I think whether it's Thailand or other parts of the region, the issue is not just, fake news comes in a number of forms. There's outright falsehoods, for example, and then the dominant narratives, who's controlling the narrative so that other narratives that need to be heard are not being heard. We often hear of people needing to be given a voice, but the issue is not so much whether the issue is not that they don't have a voice. They have a voice, but they need a platform so that other narratives could be heard. And this brings me to the other question: how do we solve fake news? It's easy to rattle off some measures, but we could sound simplistic along the way. But I go back to what I was saying earlier about the need for the media to go back to what it's really supposed to do, and how should it be doing its job? Is it doing its job well enough so that people value the work of the media? And as people value the work of the media, they would have less reason to believe disinformation. And there are some very basic, I think, fundamental questions that need to be answered, at least for the media. And we also need to be thinking in terms of how did we get to be here in the first place. But then at some point we need to be shifting the conversation so that we're not just looking at the problem, but exploring solutions. And it's good that that question was asked, because I've been to a number of discussions. This is not to make light of the value of a forum like this, but we need to be we need to be moving to the next level in terms of really exploring, at least exploring potential solutions to the kinds of issues that we're talking about. We don't want to be going to the next forum talking about the same things, and at the end of it, not quite realizing what direction do we need to be moving into if we want to see some solutions to these kinds of issues. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be. But we need to be starting to take some concrete measures to address the kinds of issues we are talking about. At the very least, I think it's time to continue the conversations among the different sectors of society and together, collectively, exploring solutions. What can the academia, for example, do? What can the church do? What can schools do? If the government is not shaping up, the government continues down the path of authoritarianism, does that stop other sectors from doing what they can, if only to let the government know this is not going to continue and we're not taking this sitting down. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. I think on that happy note, would you like one final question? We've got time, I think. Please identify yourself.
Jesper Dupping from Mahidol University. I'm from business, so I have a little bit of different angle into it, where I'm thinking about, you're discussing it very much as the state versus the public. When I look at my internet and what my colleagues are researching on marketing, I think the issue is much more about the information and the news which are pushed to us. That means that actually, I cannot help, or I want to hear your opinion about, for me, it sounds much more like that the marketing strategy of selling certain political viewpoints is now becoming a discussion about censorship and fake news. And I think it's two different things. One is marketing, and another thing is a discussion about the state and who judges what is actually fake news. But we are overlooking the fact that actually political messages are marketed to a much larger degree than ever before. Or what do you think?
Yeah, maybe coming from the business background, you're using the term marketing. Politicians would use the word campaigning. For Article 19, for international law, that's expression. The motivation is not the key factor in whether something should be restricted or not. And I don't think that international law, human rights principles, our work as human rights advocates, we're not judging based on the content or the motivation, unless the motivation, of course, is to violate human rights. But I do think you're getting to another problem, which there is an avenue for advocacy for us, which is it's not only the person that's spreading that speech, but the social media platforms themselves are deciding what you're seeing. And that is something that we think can be problematic, and the actions of social media platforms have been problematic. We're pushing Facebook and other social media platforms to adopt international law standards that protect freedom of expression in the same way that states do. They're not bound by that law. But I think what's problematic is not only that sometimes speech is restricted, which is protected speech under international law, but that the manner in which it's done is not transparent and doesn't really. International law on freedom of expression is as much about process as content. And so what we're asking for is the same transparency, so that people know what they're looking at. When they don't see something, they know why. And when a speaker has their content, or a marketer or a campaigner has their content taken down or de-escalated, that they know why. And so I think there's this is intersecting, but I don't think the fact necessarily that it's a marketing campaign or it's a political campaign for us is a big deal. But the way that information is handled by the social media platforms is.
Right. Thank you. Oh, finally, you have a question? Okay, last one of the evening.
Okay. I'm Catherine DeCrocco. I'm visiting, and I'm a consumer of your news. And I think the gentleman's question about scale really matters, because while you're talking about freedom of expression from a country's perspective, the scale of social media is so great that that freedom of expression is also limited by the people who actually forward your posts, who forward your news, who forward bloggers' commentary. And for commentary, I don't have a problem at all with bloggers. I think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, they have a lot of influence. However, when the rubber meets the road, when there's a crisis, I want news. And I want to know that the news that I'm forwarding and that I'm reading from my peers in my community is actually validated and following those protocols that Tess mentioned. And so I have to say I spend too much time reading things on Facebook or wherever, on Twitter and so forth, and trying to discern, is this a credible source or not? Is this something that given my own integrity and position, that I should forward or share or not? And I want a much easier way to do that. So I feel like part of this discussion is not only about the legal perspective, but also about the self-governance perspective. And I do wonder if an organization like FCCT or press clubs or press associations couldn't have some mechanism, whether it's your own blockchain that journalists are able to go out and get a certificate that validates that they're following journalistic professional protocols. If I were able to see some mechanism like that indicated that what I'm reading is credible, that would make it so much easier for people like me or people who are critical thinkers to actually share and push this information out just as rapidly as the trolls. But we don't have that right now. And I think that this is a problem that you all are in a unique position to address.
Thanks very much for that. I think blockchain certification and other ideas are kind of like quite new and out there. I don't know if any of you would like to respond to that.
I was just going to say it's going to be, I mean, in the old days, the way you used to share information is you'd read something in the newspaper and then you'd call your friend and talk to him. And you'd have an exchange back and forth. Part of the problem is that because of the attention span of people have been sort of so fractured that you read something and you share it and, you know, you're not sure who's going to read it next or who's going to see it. I mean, I don't know. I'm always a little reluctant to get into certification standards, especially when you're dealing with something like media. You know, I mean, I think to a certain extent, reputation of the media is that own certification standard. You know, I mean, I'm reluctant to get into a rating agency. I mean, you could say that the media councils are supposed to do some of these things, that they're supposed to, you know, through the self-regulation process, play a role in this. But I mean, if you look around in the region, there aren't that many media councils, and the governments aren't keen necessarily in either setting them up or allowing them to be truly independent.
Right. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry,
Tess,
just
final
very
word?
quickly.
Yeah.
I go back to what I was saying earlier about the need to expand our notion of media literacy, so that I think among others, people need to have their own sense of accountability for what they share, what they upload. That you know, this kind of problem is not just the responsibility of the state, for example, or you know, the usual stakeholders, but that everyone in society has a role to play, and this is something that should be part of any media literacy or similar initiative, so that people take responsibility for their own actions. But of course, that's easier said than done. But it should go beyond just certain skills, some very basic skills. But people given the landscape where we now operate, people need to understand that each one has a responsibility. That merely sharing information, makes you accountable for, certain false news going viral, for example.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Kirsten, if you have any other final word from Singapore? I think you're leaving. I think you've just been cut off, actually.
Our fake news law has literally just been assented.
Okay, I think that was a sign-off, was it? Was it? I didn't quite catch that. Okay, on that note, I think I'd just like to thank all the panellists, and thank you all for coming and great questions, and I hope that sort of took the debate forward a bit. Well, I'm not sure where that leaves us in Thailand, but maybe there's some hope there with this kind of discussion and ideas about spreading awareness and maybe some more action on the part of the public as well. Anyway, thank you very much, and please don't forget the events I mentioned earlier. If you're interested in the documentaries and other events, the newsletter is at the entrance. Thank you very much. And thank you, Kirsten, for sitting through that in Singapore. Great. Thanks.